So the topic of my talk, and sort of more broadly of this little mini conference in general, is the pro-life movement and the First Amendment. And you may be asking, why the First Amendment? Why do we care about the First Amendment? Well, just sit tight, and we'll tell you over the course of the next 2 hours. So let's jump right into it. So my talk is the First Amendment versus abortion rights. Now, to answer your question, why am I talking about this? Why is the First Amendment so important for those of us who believe in the dignity and sanctity of all human life from conception to natural death? And the reason I believe this is important, my thesis is basically this. Over the course of the next 20 or so years, we're going to see in our law, in our public policy, two competing sets of claimed rights. On the one hand, you will have pro-lifers who will be clinging to their First Amendment rights to free speech and free exercise of religion, and that is being opposed by the claimed rights of the pro-choice side to universal access to abortion. Now, we have the advantage that our rights are actually in the Constitution, and the other side not actually in the Constitution. Made up by Supreme Court justices reading into the Constitution whatever they want. But this is, I think, going to be, in many ways, the key political battles for those of us in the pro-life movement over the next 20 years. So let me dig into some of the big reasons why that is. So the first thing that I thought I would do is talk about the First Amendment, and talk about two rights in the First Amendment specifically, which I've underlined here. The First Amendment, what and why? Right there you have the text of the First Amendment, and I have sort of underlined the two key things we're going to be discussing today. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of people to assemble or petition the government, blah, blah, blah. So we're dealing with the rights to free speech and a free exercise of religion. And I think it's important for us to understand those two rights before we continue on with the rest of the conference. So let's talk about freedom of speech. One thing that people don't understand is that they read the words freedom of speech and simply interpret it literally as the ability to talk or the ability to communicate. And it leads to difficult questions because the First Amendment doesn't interpret itself. So it says, Congress can't abridge my freedom of speech. Does that mean that I'm allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater? Does that mean if I have an angry mob that wants to beat someone up, I can yell, go get him? And does it cover any kind of expressive activity at all? What if I want to produce pornography? What if I want to do this? What if I want to do interpretive dance in a public building? There are all these sort of questions that people present because, well, it's expressive. You can't hinder my freedom of speech. But no, the First Amendment does not protect all of those kinds of activities. It does not protect your right to yell fire in a crowded theater. It does not protect your right to do things like libel or slander, publishing false and damaging things about people. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, it was sort of most of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were meant to safeguard the traditionally held rights of English citizens, which, before the Revolution, the King of England was sort of violating as it related to the American colonists. That was why they thought it was so important to stick it right in the Constitution in those first 10 amendments when the Constitution was ratified. The freedom of speech is a kind of term of art, and it related to basically protecting certain core things. So the core of what the First Amendment freedom of speech is designed to protect is speech that relates to political, social, cultural, and religious questions. That is the center of what the First Amendment is designed to protect. It's designed to protect your right to express your viewpoints regarding these key, important social and political questions without fear that the government's going to censor you and without fear that the government is going to force you to say things you don't believe in. Right? So that's the core of the First Amendment. That's the core of the right to freedom of speech. There are other kinds of speech that have some protection under the First Amendment, but not as much. So things like commercial speech, advertisements. The government can regulate advertising a little bit more than it can regulate, for example, my ability to speak up here and talk with you today about these kinds of questions. Those of us who advocate for the pro-life position should have some confidence that in our advocacy, we are advocating for the exact kinds of things the First Amendment is designed to protect. So that is sort of as I said, we're going to have these two competing sides of alleged rights. The other thing on our side is the right to free exercise of religion. And note those words, free exercise. A lot of times you'll read in media accounts, people will use as shorthand for this right, the right to freedom of worship. That is not what this right protects. Freedom of worship is something different from free exercise of religion. Do you see how those two terms are different? Freedom of worship, seemingly, in my eyes, relates to what you do on Sunday. Free exercise of religion, yes, has to do with what you do on Sunday, but it also has to do with what you do Monday through Saturday, in your business, in your public life, in commerce, etc. Okay? So that is something really key to focus on. Now, those are the things that we have on our side to protect us in advancing our viewpoints. What about the other side? So the other side's basic thesis is this, that the right to legalized abortion is a right to access abortion. And let me dig into that word access. So in the 90s, and Bill Clinton is my representative for the 90s over there, in the 90s you heard this phrase spoken a lot, that abortion should not only be safe and legal, it should be rare. And that language was used all the time. Safe, legal, rare. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Safe, legal, rare. And that was, obviously, we as pro-lifers don't think of that as an adequate expression of what abortion should be. If you believe that unborn human beings are a member of the community of human beings and have rights and have dignity and should be treated with respect under law, abortion being legal is inadequate. However, it led to people who consider themselves pro-choice to support some more reasonable public policy positions as it relates to abortion. So in the 90s, you would see members of the otherwise mostly pro-choice Democratic Party vote for things like restricting federal funding for abortion. Okay? You would see them vote in favor of things like conscience protections for doctors and hospitals who don't want to participate in abortion. So even as liberal as they are, the ACLU advocated for positions like that to protect doctors and nurses and hospitals that don't want to do abortions. As liberal as the Democratic Party has been on abortion since roughly the 80s, the Democratic Party never supported public federal funding directly to pay for abortion through federal health care programs like Medicaid. But now we're moving into the 2010s, and the language is shifting. And really, this shift has happened in the last 10 years. So on the right, that is sort of my avatar for the 2010s. The chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, in a speech, talked about how abortion should be safe, legal, and accessible. 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 I'm going to keep pounding that word into your head because you're going to be hearing it more and more and more. Accessible. They're on the pro-choice left now. They are constantly talking about abortion accessibility. Now, what does that mean? Abortion accessibility, it sort of harkens back to certain kinds of socialist thought, that basically that if you have a right to something, that is meaningless unless you can exercise that right. Okay, so, for example, in Soviet Russia, the Soviet Constitution said everyone has a right to work. And because they had a communist government that completely controlled the entire economy, there was 0% unemployment because every single person had a job delegated to each and every single one of them by the government. Basically, the modern pro-choice left is advocating sort of a similar mindset, that if you have a right to abortion, that is meaningless if there is any barrier to you getting abortion. So we are going to knock down each and every single barrier that could possibly exist to you having an abortion. So what kind of barriers are there? So the first barrier is public funding for abortion. All right. 2016, for the first time in its history, the Democratic Party, in its party platform, and I should emphasize, this is not a pro-Republican or anti-Democrat or talk or anything. We're a 501c3, we're nonprofit. So I'm just describing the situation as it is. So this is not a Trump rally, so don't worry about that. And we're going to talk about some of the things President Trump has done, both good and bad, as it relates to the pro-life movement, particularly for the last talk of the day. So for the first time in its history in 2016, the Democratic Party put as part of its party platform. So the platform is the official statement of what the party as a whole believes. For the first time ever, put in their party platform that they advocated repealing the Hyde Amendment. And the Hyde Amendment is this rider that gets attached to the federal budget every single year that prohibits federal funding in healthcare programs like Medicaid for paying for abortions. So they want full public funding to pay for abortion directly. They are already doing that in California. Medi-Cal, which is our state's Medicaid program. And for those of you who don't quite know what Medicaid is, I know we have some younger, some teenagers here in the audience. Medicaid is basically a federally funded health insurance program where if you're in a lower income bracket between X and X per year, you qualify to get health insurance that's subsidized, paid for in large part by the government. Okay, Medi-Cal is our state California's version of Medicaid. In California, Medi-Cal will pay for abortions. They can't use federal money to pay for it, so they tax you and me and set up a stream of purely California-based taxpayer dollars to pay for abortion directly. So this is at the core of accessibility, that if there's any barrier to a woman being able to get an abortion, and one of those barriers is often money, then someone else will pay for it. And that someone else is usually the taxpayers. Other ways in which abortion accessibility is sort of rearing its head is in fighting against conscience protections for doctors and hospitals who, because of religious or moral convictions, do not want to participate in abortion. The ACLU has been filing lawsuits against certain Catholic hospitals in more rural areas where the Catholic hospital is the only hospital there, saying that by not offering abortions, you're depriving women of their right to abortion access. Now, that's not a well-established right yet. The ACLU is losing those lawsuits, but they're planting the seed. They're trying to eventually bring about changes in the law. We're also seeing real calls to repeal state laws that protect doctors, nurses, and hospitals that don't want to participate in abortion. So how many of you have heard of Rahm Emanuel, who's President Obama's former chief of staff? Okay, he's the mayor of Chicago. He was President Obama's former chief of staff. He's a very powerful guy. His brother is Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. And Ezekiel Emanuel, a lot of you may not know him, he was one of the guys who wrote Obamacare, who wrote the Affordable Care Act. So he was sort of the architect of that law. So he's a very prominent, powerful, influential guy in the areas of medicine and public policy. He had an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the most prominent medical journals in the country. My parents are doctors, and we had a copy of New England Journal of Medicine sitting around the house like my whole child. They still do. He had an op-ed in the New England Journal of Medicine explicitly calling for every state in the union that has laws protecting doctors and nurses to repeal them, saying that no, abortion is now a, quote, accepted procedure, and that therefore you should if you don't want to do abortions, then you shouldn't become an OB. You shouldn't become an obstetric nurse. You shouldn't run a hospital. That is the new, and the idea behind it is that having hospitals that don't do abortions, that limits women's right to access abortion. And again, the supposed right to abortion is something that really the Supreme Court, it didn't draw from the text of the Constitution. It drew from their vague interpretations of what the term liberty means within the context of the Constitution. They were reading into the Constitution what they wanted to read. So, again, look out for this word, accessibility. This is the new language of the pro-choice movement, that abortion should be safe, legal, and accessible. So, not that it should be rare anymore. They're not saying that anymore. And in California, the most wild expression of this need for abortion to be accessible is a bill that's before the California legislature called SB 320. Jonathan's going to talk about it later today. Basically what this would do is take every student health center in California and force them to provide abortion medication. So chemical abortion medication, right there at the student health center. So Jonathan will be talking about that more. So I'll move on. The other mindset that we're going to have to deal with over the next 20 years is the idea of pro-life advocacy as violence. So let me tell you a story. Last year, there was a national day of prayer and protest against Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood gets lots of federal money. Planned Parenthood performs about 300,000 abortions a year in this country. They're a leading public policy proponent for abortion policy. So we had a national day of prayer, praying for them to be defunded. So I took, and I think there may be a few of you here today who were with me that day. It was a Saturday morning, and I went to the Planned Parenthood clinic in Fresno, and we were peacefully, and I can't emphasize that enough, we were peacefully praying outside the Planned Parenthood. Well, they had heard about, the Planned Parenthood people, I guess, had heard that we were going to do this, and they set up a kind of counter-protest. And they had a whole bunch of people out there. And there was one gal in particular who was almost like, I was terrified because I thought she was about to punch some of my protesters in the face. She was smoking cigarettes and blowing the smoke in their face. She had a megaphone and was yelling right in their ears. She was kind of being threatening to my wife and my baby. And so I asked her, hey, can you cut this out? Like, we're not hurting anybody. We're just being peaceful out here. And she said, no, what you're doing is an act of violence. Now, why did she say that? What she said is actually reflective of a new trend in the pro-choice movement. It's this thing called a microaggression. Now, some of you have heard of this. You've heard of the term microaggression. You've heard of the term safe spaces. And most of the time when more conservative people talk about these things, they just talk about them to laugh at them and make fun of them. And what I want to tell you is that it shouldn't be laughed at or made fun of. This is actually a really serious idea that can have serious implications going forward. So I know I'm getting close to overtime, but I'm going to run through this quick. So the concept behind a microaggression is that a macroaggression is someone punching you in the face. Okay, that causes physical harm. And someone punching you in the face is not protected by the First Amendment. Okay? You can regulate people punching you in the face, obviously. But the theory goes that if I say things that are genuinely hurtful because they're attacking rights you have or positions you hold dear or something like that, the emotional distress it causes you is itself a form of violence. All right? Now, a more legitimate, possibly I would say a more legitimate expression of that would be if I were to get up here and say racist things that were denying people of one particular race their rights under law. They would say, now I would view that as it's something protected under the First Amendment. It's wrong, it's hateful, and it should be countered with more speech. That's how we do debate in this country. That's how the First Amendment works. It's unfortunate that people like Nazis and racists, are out there, but we've managed in this country to survive with a First Amendment that protects their right to speak and my right to speak. However, the problem is it doesn't just stop at people who are racist. Many on the pro-choice side would say that me being up here today saying things like, I believe abortion is wrong, and I believe that abortion should be highly regulated and illegal in all cases except to save the life of the mother. There are many pro-choice people who would say that my saying that is a microaggression, that it is an act of violence, and therefore that it isn't really speech. Remember what I was saying earlier at the beginning, that the First Amendment at its core is meant to protect speech on political, social, religious, cultural topics, things like that. They would say, no. What you're doing is actually more similar to the guy in front of a big angry mob yelling, "Go get him." You're inflicting violence. And so that speech, on my part, should be able to be regulated. It should be designated as something like hate speech. Now, that is the mindset. Now, you may think that is totally nuts. Like, that is just completely crazy. Let me tell you something. There are a lot of people at universities all over this country, college professors, students, etc., who 100% believe this to be true. And some of them are in law schools, and some of them are in really prominent law schools. And if they're in really prominent law schools, let me tell you something, they're going to be judges someday. And they're going to be appellate court judges someday. And they could be Supreme Court judges someday. Okay? And it's at the Supreme Court where we would possibly be redefining the limits of what is and what isn't protected under the First Amendment. So don't think that, just because you see, I know that it's a common conservative thing. Look at those snowflakes crying, oh, they need their safe spaces. But don't laugh at this. This is actually a really serious thing that could be a real serious challenge to our rights under the First Amendment. Now, how is this practically revealing itself? It's practically revealing itself in a couple of ways. One is in terms of laws that are restricting the ability of pro-life advocates to advocate outside of abortion clinics. That happened in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, they made laws saying there's a buffer zone in front of an abortion clinic, and you can't get within a certain number of feet to protest. Now, the Supreme Court struck that law down, but it was a close vote. It was like a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court, okay? A couple of dead Supreme Court justices and a couple of new picks on the Supreme Court by a president could swing that either way. So don't think that that's a settled question. Another and more common thing is to see pro-life groups on public university campuses. Now, on a public university campus, the administration has, if they're going to allow students to speak on questions of public policy, at a public university, they're agents of the government. They have to respect the First Amendment rights of their students. So they can't pick and choose between, well, we'll let the pro-choice group have the ability to speak, but we're not going to let the pro-life group have the ability to speak. And what we've seen is on dozens of public university campuses are pro-life groups, like Fresno State Students for Life, who are harassed, who are bullied, who are denied the ability to speak by administrators, who have their displays shut down by administrators. So these are this mindset, and it's all motivated, though, by this mindset that pro-life advocacy, pro-life speech is not actually speech. It is an act of violence. So I think that sort of sums up my sort of laying out the table for all of us today. And these are, the two sides that I see, the two competing sets of rights that I see sort of laying the table for the challenges the pro-life movement is going to face over the next 20 years. What is more important? The rights to free speech and to free exercise of religion, or, on the other side, the right to abortion being safe, legal, and universally accessible?